The night before I opened that basement, I couldn't sleep. Not because of an alarm. I don't use alarms, I never have. My body has always had its own internal clock that I both appreciate and resent depending on the day. I woke up because the house was making a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, almost subsonic vibration that I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. Like the building was humming to itself in a frequency just below perception. I lay on the air mattress and listened for a long time. Then I got up, made coffee on the camp stove, put on my work clothes, picked up my toolbox and my flashlight and my camera. I document everything. It is a professional habit that has saved me more times than I can count, and I walked to the east wing. It was just after 5 in the morning. The light was gray and preliminary, the kind that makes everything look like it is still deciding whether to exist. The house was cold. Old houses hold cold the way they hold everything else, completely, in every surface, in the walls and the floors and the air itself. I stood in front of the door. I have been asked, at least 100 times since all of this came out, whether I regret buying the house. And every single time, I pause before I answer. Not because the answer is complicated, but because the honest answer surprises people. They expect me to say yes. They expect the story of a woman who found something she wasn't supposed to find and spent the rest of her life wishing she hadn't looked. But that's not my story. My story is stranger than that. And quieter. And in the end, and I mean the very end, the part most people don't stay long enough to hear, it is something close to beautiful. But we are not at the end yet. We are at the beginning. Which starts, as so many things in my life have started, with a terrible idea that turned out to be the best decision I ever made. I bought a house for $500. Let me explain how that's possible, because I know how it sounds. In certain parts of the United States, particularly in the Midwest, in older cities where population has declined and property tax delinquency has created a backlog of abandoned buildings that municipalities cannot maintain and cannot sell through conventional channels, county governments hold auctions. They list the properties with minimal description. They set starting bids that reflect not the value of the building but the county's desire to simply transfer the liability to someone else. And occasionally, if you are paying attention and you know what you are looking at, you find something extraordinary buried in a listing that was designed to attract no one. My name is not important. For this story, call me Nora. At 34, I was the kind of person who had done everything right and arrived at a life that felt completely wrong. I had a degree I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for. I had a career in architectural salvage, finding, restoring, and reselling pieces from historic buildings that I had built from nothing over 8 years. I had a husband named Marcus who was handsome and charming and who I had loved, genuinely and completely, for 6 years. And then, inside the space of 4 months, I had none of those things. The career went first. The company I worked for collapsed in a way that was spectacular even by the standards of small businesses collapsing, legal issues, missing funds, a partner who turned out to have been running things in ways that I had not known about and became, briefly and humiliatingly, the subject of a regulatory investigation before being cleared. I lost my job, my professional reputation took damage it would take years to repair, and I spent the better part of 3 months explaining to various officials that I was an employee, not a conspirator. Marcus went second. Or perhaps more accurately, Marcus had already gone, and I simply didn't know it yet. The investigation, the stress, the financial pressure, the version of me that was frightened and exhausted and needed things from him that he had never actually been built to give, it revealed, with the particular efficiency of crisis, that what I had thought was a partnership was actually a performance. He left on a Tuesday. He was kind about it, which almost made it worse. By the time October came, I was living in a sublet in a city I had moved to for a man who no longer lived in it, with savings that were evaporating at a rate that kept me awake most nights, and a professional identity that felt like a coat I was no longer sure fit me. I was, in the clinical sense, fine. In every other sense, I was not. And then I found the auction listing. I have loved old buildings my whole life. Not in a romantic, abstract way, not the way people say they love old buildings while scrolling through photos of Tuscan farmhouses on their phones. I mean in the specific, physical, almost obsessive way of someone who has spent years learning to read them. The way a crack in a plaster wall tells you about the settling of a foundation. The way a particular style of doorknob dates a room to a decade. The way you can stand in an empty house that has been empty for 30 years and still feel, in the quality of the light and the smell of the air and the particular silence, the life that was lived inside it. Old buildings hold things. That is what I believe. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a real, material sense. The choices people made. The things they built and the things they kept. The evidence of lives. You just have to know how to look. So when I found the listing, a county tax auction in a small town in Ohio, a property described only as historic residential, 11 rooms, 4,200 square feet, requires substantial renovation, sold as is, with a starting bid of $100, I felt something I had not felt in 4 months. I felt interested. I did 3 days of research. I found the address. I found the house on old county maps, built in 1887, originally the home of a family named Aldrich who had made their money in regional banking, passed through several owners over the following century, and eventually abandoned sometime in the late 1990s when the last recorded occupant, a woman named Cecelia Aldrich Moore who appeared to be a descendant of the original family, had died without a will and without heirs willing to claim the property. For 26 years, it had sat. I drove out on a Thursday to look at it before the auction. The grounds were wild. The porch sagged on one side. Several of the upper windows were boarded. There was a quality to the property of something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. But the bones of that house were extraordinary. Original Victorian millwork along every roofline. A wraparound porch that, despite the sag, was structurally present in a way that told me the foundation beneath it was solid. Windows, the ones that weren't boarded, that were original leaded glass, the kind that throws small rainbows across a floor in afternoon light and that you simply cannot replicate with modern manufacturing. A front door of carved walnut, 11 feet tall, that was still, despite everything, hanging true in its frame. I stood on the street in front of that house for a long time. And then I drove back to the city, liquidated a portion of my remaining savings that I probably should not have touched, and registered for the auction. I paid $540. $500 for the winning bid. $40 in administrative fees. I owned a mansion. The first 2 weeks were about survival, not exploration. I had enough money left to buy supplies and pay for the utilities to be reconnected. I moved in with an air mattress, a camp stove, a cooler, and a box of books. I started in the kitchen because the kitchen is always where you start. It tells you the most about the structural systems of the house, about plumbing and electrical and the decisions previous owners made. I worked 12 hours a day. I talked to the house constantly, the way you talk to an animal you are trying to earn the trust of. The electrical was a disaster. The plumbing was worse. But these were problems with solutions, and I have always found problems with solutions more manageable than the other kind. And then, on day 17, I found the basement door. I say found because that is genuinely what it felt like, even though it was, technically, visible from the moment I moved in. It was in the east wing, a part of the ground floor that had clearly been some kind of study or library, with built-in shelving along 3 walls and a fireplace with an original cast-iron surround. The door was in the corner, partially obscured by a large shelving unit that someone had pushed in front of it. The shelving unit was not covering the door accidentally. I understood this immediately when I looked at it carefully. It had been positioned there deliberately, with intention. Someone had moved a piece of furniture that was not easy to move and placed it specifically in front of this door. I moved the shelving unit. It took most of an afternoon. The door behind it was unlike any other interior door in the house. The other doors were the original Victorian millwork, paneled, elegant, with their original hardware. This door was plain. Solid. Heavy in a way that the others were not. It had been painted over multiple times, the layers visible at the edges like geological strata, and at some point a hasp and padlock had been added. The padlock was old. Rusted. When I looked at it closely I could see that the rust had formed inside the mechanism, which meant it had been locked for a very long time and had not been touched since. I stood in front of that door for a long time. I did not open it that day. I went back to my air mattress. I made dinner on the camp stove. I read for a while, or tried to. I listened to the house breathe in the dark. And I did not sleep. I had bought, the previous afternoon, a bolt cutter from the hardware store in town. The hardware store was run by a man named Gerald who had the particular quality of small-town hardware store owners everywhere: unhurried, encyclopedic, and deeply uninterested in asking questions about what you were cutting. I had also bought a new padlock, because whatever was behind that door, I wanted to be able to secure it again once I knew what I was dealing with. The padlock was old. When I positioned the bolt cutter on the shackle, it gave with less resistance than I expected. The rust had eaten through most of the metal's integrity. The shackle separated cleanly and the padlock fell into my hand, lighter than it looked, the way very old things often are. I set it on the shelf beside me. I would keep it. I keep everything. I gripped the door handle, plain iron, cold as water, and I pulled. The door did not want to open. 26 years of paint and humidity and settling had fused it to its frame in the particular stubborn way of things that have been stationary for too long. I pulled harder. Then I braced my foot against the doorframe and pulled with my whole body. With a sound that was somewhere between a crack and a sigh, like something exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time, the door came open. The smell hit me first. I want to describe it accurately because it was unlike anything I had encountered before, and I have opened a great many old sealed spaces in my career. It was not the smell of rot, which I had been half expecting. It was not damp or mold or the sharp chemical smell of decay. It was something older and drier than that. Something mineral. Stone and time and the particular compressed stillness of air that has not moved in decades. And beneath that, very faint, the way a memory is faint, present but not insistent, something else. Something I couldn't identify immediately. Something that reminded me, absurdly, of libraries. Of old paper. Of a room where someone had once spent a great deal of time thinking. I stood in the doorway and shone my flashlight down. Stone steps. 11 of them. Wide and solid, cut from the same local limestone that the foundation was built from. Original to the house. The walls on either side were stone as well, rough cut, with the marks of the tools that had shaped them still visible if you looked closely. I went down. I want to be honest about what I felt descending those steps. People always ask, were you scared? And the honest answer is yes, but not in the way they mean. I was not frightened of what might be there in the supernatural sense. What I felt was something more primal and harder to name. The particular vulnerability of moving through darkness into an unknown space. The animal awareness of entering somewhere that your eyes cannot fully process. My flashlight found the floor at the bottom, stone again, smooth and dry, and then began sweeping the space around me. It was larger than I had expected. Much larger. The basement ran the full length of the east wing and possibly beyond, the far wall lost in shadows that my single flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, supported by original wooden beams that were, I noted with the professional part of my brain that never entirely switches off, in remarkable condition. No water damage. No rot. The sealed door, whatever else it had done, had kept this space extraordinarily preserved. And then my flashlight beam moved across the room and I stopped walking. I stopped completely. I think I stopped breathing for a moment. Because the basement was not empty. It was full. Not full in the way of a storage space, not boxes and old furniture and the accumulated detritus of household living. Full in a different way. A deliberate way. The way a room is full when someone has arranged it with intention, with care, with a specific vision of how things should be and where they should go. Along the left wall, floor to ceiling, were shelves. Built in, hand-constructed, the same craftsmanship as the shelving in the study above. And on those shelves, I moved closer, my flashlight beam traveling slowly, books. Hundreds of books. Some in cases, some simply stacked. Old books, the kind with cloth and leather covers that hold their shape over decades. Along the right wall, a workbench. Long, solid, with the surface worn smooth in the particular way of a workspace that has seen years of daily use. Above it, tools hung on iron hooks, not construction tools. Smaller tools. More precise. The kind used for delicate work. Restoration work. Preservation work. And in the center of the room, a table. A proper table with a chair pushed up to it as if someone had just stepped away and would be back in a moment. On the table, arranged with the neatness of someone who thought carefully about where things belonged, a lamp, unlit, its oil long since evaporated. A magnifying glass. A pair of cotton gloves, the kind archivists use when handling fragile documents. And a leather journal, closed, with a length of ribbon marking a page somewhere near the middle. I stood in the center of that room for a very long time. Who had built this room? Not built, furnished it. The room itself was as old as the house. But someone had arranged it like this. Someone had chosen these shelves, these tools, this table, this chair. Someone had curated this space with the particular intentionality of a person who knew exactly what they were doing and why. And someone had sealed it. Not neglected it. Not forgotten it. Sealed it. Pushed a heavy shelving unit in front of the door. Added a padlock. Locked it from the outside and left. Why do you seal a room? I have thought about this question more in the past year than I have thought about almost anything else. And the answers I keep arriving at are variations on the same theme. You seal a room because you are not ready to deal with what is inside it. Or because you want to protect what is inside it. Or because the person who knew what was inside it is gone, and the sealing is a kind of grief, a way of saying this was hers and I cannot bring myself to disturb it. I believed, standing in that basement on that gray February morning, that the third answer was the right one. This had been Cecilia's room. I walked to the table. I set my flashlight down so it illuminated the surface. I looked at the journal for a long moment. I did not touch it yet. I am a professional. I have worked with fragile and historically significant objects for 8 years. I know that the right approach to something like this is not to grab it with both hands because you are curious. The right approach is to document first. To photograph. To understand the context before you disturb any element of it. So I photographed everything. Systematically, methodically, moving around the room in a grid pattern the way I had been trained to do in spaces of historical significance. Every shelf. Every tool on the workbench. Every surface of the table. I used my camera's flash because the flashlight created shadows that obscured detail, and I needed detail. It took 2 hours. I went back up the stairs. I made more coffee. I sat on the floor of the East Wing study and I looked at the photographs on my camera's small screen, going through them one by one. The books on the shelves were organized by subject. And the subjects, once I began to identify them from the spines visible in the photographs, told a story of their own. Local history. Ohio history broadly, but local history specifically, county histories, town records, family genealogies. architectural history, preservation methodology. And mixed among these, scattered throughout the shelves in a way that suggested they were used frequently, personal documents, folders, binders, envelopes. The workbench tools were for paper conservation. Bone folders, small brushes, weights, the specific configuration of tools that someone uses when they are repairing and preserving documents. Old documents. Fragile documents. Cecelia Aldrich Moore had been a preservationist. Not a professional one, or not primarily, there was no evidence of formal credentials in what I had photographed. But a dedicated one. Someone who had spent years, possibly decades, in this room, working on something. I looked at the photograph of the table. At the journal. At the cotton gloves beside it. At the magnifying glass positioned at a specific angle that suggested it had been set down mid-use and never picked up again. She had been working on something when she died. I finished my coffee. I stood up. I walked back to the east wing, back down the stone stairs, back into the room that smelled of old paper and mineral stillness and something I still couldn't quite name. I sat down in Cecilia's chair. I picked up the cotton gloves and put them on. And I opened the journal. The handwriting inside was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship at a time when penmanship was considered important and had maintained the habit ever since. Dark ink, slightly faded at the edges of the strokes but entirely legible. The paper was cream-colored, heavy, the kind of paper that lasts. The entry on the marked page was dated March 14, 1987. It said, "I have found it. After 31 years of looking, I have finally found what Father said didn't exist. The question now is not whether it is real. The question is what to do about it. Some discoveries, once made, cannot be unmade. Some truths, once known, change everything that came before them. I need to think carefully about what this means. I need to think carefully about who else needs to know. And I need to decide, before I am too old to act on the decision, whether the truth is always worth the cost of telling it." I sat in Cecilia's chair in Cecilia's room and I read that entry 3 times. Then I turned the page. And I began to understand what she had found. I will tell you what was in that journal. But I need to tell you something first about the experience of reading it, because the experience matters, and because I think if I skip it and go straight to the contents, you will understand the information but miss the thing that made it mean something. Reading Cecilia's journal was like listening to someone talk in the next room. You can hear the voice. You can hear the cadence and the emotion and the shape of what is being said. But you are getting it through a wall, filtered, incomplete, dependent on your own interpretation of sounds that were never meant for you. She had not written this journal for an audience. She had written it for herself, as a record, as a thinking out loud, as the kind of document you create when you are working through something too large and too complicated to hold in your head alone. Which meant that she assumed, on every page, a context that I did not have. It was, in other words, a puzzle. And I have always been very good at puzzles. I read for 6 hours without stopping. By the time I looked up, the thin thread of morning light coming down the stairs had shifted to the warm amber of late afternoon, and my back ached and my eyes burned and my coffee from that morning was a memory. But I had the shape of it. The Aldrich family had built this house in 1887 on the foundation of something that had existed before it. Not a building, the original structure had been demolished before the mansion's construction. But a history. A specific and significant local history that the Aldrich family had, over several generations, worked very carefully to obscure. Cecilia's father had told her, when she was a young woman, that there was nothing to find. That the family history was exactly what it appeared to be, a prosperous banking family, civic-minded, respectable, their money made in the straightforward way of regional finance in the 19th century. That anyone who suggested otherwise was mistaken or motivated by jealousy or simply wrong. She had believed him. For years, she had believed him. And then, in 1956, when she was in her late 20s, she had found something in this house. Something small. Something that father had not known was there, or had forgotten, or had assumed no one would ever look closely enough to find. A letter. Hidden inside the frame of a mirror in one of the upper bedrooms. The kind of hiding place that only reveals itself when a mirror is removed for repair, which this one had been, because Cecelia was meticulous about the house in the way of someone who has nothing but the house and loves it completely. The letter was old, she estimated mid-1850s based on the paper and the ink. It was addressed to no one. It was signed with initials only. And what it described, carefully, in the formal language of a person documenting something they knew was wrong and were documenting anyway, perhaps as a kind of confession, perhaps as insurance, was a transaction. A specific transaction. Involving land. Land that had been acquired through means that were not legal. Not technically legal in the sense that the acquisition had been recorded and processed through appropriate channels. But not legal in the deeper sense that the people from whom the land had been taken had not consented to the taking, had not been compensated for it, had in fact been actively deceived about what was happening until it was too late for deception to matter. The letter named names. It named the family that had lost the land. It described what had happened to them afterward, where they had gone, what they had been forced to leave behind, the specific mechanisms by which a prosperous and established family had been reduced, over the course of a few years in the 1840s, to nothing. And it named the Aldriches. By name. As the architects of what had been done. Cecelia had hidden the letter again after reading it. She had hidden it and she had tried to forget about it. She had tried to do what her father had told her to do, which was to believe the family history as it was presented and not to look for things that didn't need to be found. She had tried for 31 years. And then, in March of 1987, she had found something else. What she had found was documentation. Not a single letter this time. A body of documentation, deeds, correspondence, legal records, financial records, that confirmed and expanded what the letter had only suggested. Records that had been, in some cases, altered. Official documents in which certain names had been carefully removed or changed, certain transactions recorded differently than they had occurred, certain histories quietly rewritten by people with access to the right offices and the right relationships and enough money to make inconvenient truths temporarily disappear. She had spent 31 years locating these documents. Requesting records from county offices. Corresponding with archives. Visiting courthouses in 3 different states. Building, piece by piece, the evidentiary foundation for a history that officially did not exist. And she had brought everything here. To this room. And she had spent the years since 1987 doing what she did in this room, preserving the documents, repairing the ones that were fragile, organizing them, annotating them, building the case with the meticulous care of someone who understands that the truth is not enough on its own. The truth needs to be legible. The truth needs to be organized. The truth needs to be presented in a way that makes it impossible to dismiss. She had been building a record. And then she had died before she could do anything with it. I sat in her chair for a long time after I understood this. Not reading. Just sitting. The basement was quiet around me in the way that it was always quiet, completely, entirely, the silence of a sealed space, and I thought about a woman who had spent most of her adult life in this room, working on something she believed mattered, and who had not lived long enough to finish. I thought about what it means to care about something for 31 years and then for another decade after that and to die with it still undone. I thought about what she would want. I went to the shelves. This was, I understood now, not a collection of general books about local history. It was a research library, assembled and organized specifically in support of this project. The folders, the binders, the envelopes, those were the work. I took down the first binder. It was labeled in Cecelia's small precise handwriting with a date range, 1838 to 1849, and a single word that I would come to understand was the name of the family whose history she had spent her life reconstructing. I am not going to tell you that name yet. Not because I am being deliberately mysterious, but because in the telling of this story, the order in which things were revealed to me matters. It shaped how I understood what I found. And I want you to understand it the way I understood it, incrementally, with the weight of each piece of information arriving in its proper sequence. What I will tell you is what was in the binder. Deeds. Copies of deeds, some originals, some reproductions, some clearly photographed from microfilm at some point in the 1970s or 80s based on the quality of the reproduction. Land deeds from the 1840s, covering parcels in this county and 2 adjacent ones. Some of the deeds were straightforward. But some of them had been annotated by Cecelia in the margins, small careful notes in pencil that flagged discrepancies. Dates that didn't align. Names that appeared in one document and not in the corresponding one. Signatures that she had compared, side by side with other examples, and noted as inconsistent. She had been doing forensic document analysis. In her basement. By herself. 4 decades. The second binder covered 1849 to 1861. More deeds. Correspondence this time as well, letters between parties whose relationship to each other and to the Aldrich family became clearer as I read. A paper trail, assembling itself slowly, of how land moves from one family to another when the mechanisms of law are available to those with money and connections and unavailable to those without. The third binder was different. Thinner. The documents inside were older and more fragile. Cecelia had mounted them on conservation paper, the way a professional archivist would, each one enclosed in a protective sleeve. These were personal documents. Not legal records. Letters, written in a different hand than anything else in the room. A woman's hand. These were letters written by someone in the family that had lost the land. I read them carefully, slowly, with the cotton gloves and the flashlight and the growing understanding that I was holding something that had not been read in a very long time and that had been kept, by one woman's determination, against the possibility that someone would eventually read it and understand what it meant. The letters were addressed to a sister who lived in another state. They described, in the careful understated language of someone trying not to alarm the recipient, a situation that was becoming alarming. Land disputes. Legal proceedings that seemed to be going wrong despite their lawyers' assurances. Meetings with county officials that produced nothing. A sense of the ground shifting in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The last letter in the sequence was dated 1847. It said, "I do not know what will happen to this place after we are gone. I do not know if anyone will remember that we were here, or that this was ours, or what was done to take it from us. I am putting this letter with the others in the place we agreed upon because I want there to be a record somewhere that tells the truth of it. Even if no one finds it for 100 years. Even if no one finds it at all. The truth should exist somewhere, even if only in a box in the ground. We were here. This was ours. That is what happened." I read that letter twice. Then I set it down very carefully on the conservation paper and I sat with my hands in my lap for a while. At the back of the third binder, behind all the documents, was a handwritten list. Names. First names, last names, dates of birth where she had been able to determine them. Some with question marks. Some with additional notations. It was a family. Assembled name by name from whatever had survived. I counted the names on the list. 37. 37 people whose lives had intersected with this land. Whose connection to this place had been severed and then buried under a history that said they had never been here in the way they had been here. Cecelia had found 37 of them. The flat file cabinet had 6 drawers. I opened the first one. Inside, laid flat in the way that maps and large documents are stored, separated by sheets of conservation tissue, were survey maps. Hand-drawn, the kind produced by county surveyors in the mid-19th century, with the particular quality of line that comes from careful draftsmanship before the age of mechanical reproduction. Each map covered a section of land. I could see the creek that still ran along the eastern edge of this property, the road that was now the county highway, the configuration of the land itself which had not changed in the ways that mattered despite 170 years of development around it. Each map had been annotated. Property lines, owner names, dates of survey. And on several of the maps, in a different ink, in handwriting I did not recognize, corrections. Small, precise corrections to boundary lines. Alterations to property designations. Changes that had been made to the official record after the fact, by someone with access to the documents and the confidence that no one would look closely enough to notice. Cecelia had noticed. Cecelia had looked at these maps alongside the originals she had located in county archives, and she had documented, with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and no one to answer to, exactly what had been changed and what the changes meant. The second drawer contained correspondence. Not the personal letters from the binders, this was official correspondence. Letters between county officials. Letters between lawyers. Letters between men whose names appeared in the legal records of this county during the 1840s and who, in certain cases, appeared also in the deed records as parties to transactions that the survey maps now told a different story about. The third drawer was photographs. Not old photographs, Cecilia's photographs, taken in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. Photographs of documents. Photographs of places. Photographs of headstones. Photographs of a specific section of what appeared to be a cemetery, taken from multiple angles, with a handwritten note attached that said only, "They are still here." The records say they left, but they are still here. Someone buried them and no one remembered to record it, or the record was removed. I set the photographs down carefully. The fourth drawer contained newer documents, mid to late 20th century. Letters written by Cecelia. Drafts of letters. She had kept her drafts, each one with corrections and revisions in pencil, the way a person works through what they want to say before committing to a final version. The letters were addressed to various institutions. Universities. Historical societies. A legal firm in Columbus. A government office that handled, among other things, claims related to historical property disputes. In each letter, Cecelia was trying to tell someone what she had found. And in the drawer beneath the drafts, the responses. Some were polite and non-committal. Some were more direct in their dismissiveness. The matters you describe occurred over a century ago and fall outside the scope of our current mandate. One, from the legal firm, was the kind of letter that lawyers write when they want to discourage further contact without explicitly saying so. One response, from a history professor at a state university, was different. It was 3 pages long. It was engaged and serious and clearly written by someone who had read Cecilia's letter carefully. It said that what she described, if the documentation was as thorough as she indicated, was historically significant. It said that he would very much like to see the materials she had assembled. Cecilia's draft response to this letter was in the drawer. She had written 3 versions. The third version said, "I need a little more time to organize my materials before I am ready to share them. I want to make sure everything is in order. I will be in touch when I am ready." The professor's final letter in the sequence said, "Of course, take all the time you need. I look forward to hearing from you." There was no further correspondence with the professor. She had never been ready. Or she had run out of time before she got there. The fifth drawer. Inside was a single folder. Thick, perhaps an inch of documents inside it. On the tab, in Cecilia's handwriting, 1 word. Not a date range. Not a subject heading. A name. Beaumont. That was the name. That was the family. The Beaumont family had owned this land before the Aldriches. Had farmed it, built on it, established themselves on it over 2 generations beginning in the early 1800s. Had been, by the accounts in Cecelia's documents, prosperous and respected members of the community in the way that families become when they have been somewhere long enough and worked hard enough to earn that standing. And then, between 1843 and 1847, they had lost everything. Not through misfortune. Not through debt or drought or the ordinary catastrophes that ended families in that era. Through a coordinated campaign involving falsified documents, manipulated legal proceedings, the strategic use of relationships with county officials who owed favors or expected them, and the particular vulnerability of a family that, despite their prosperity and their standing, had one characteristic that made them vulnerable in ways that the Aldriches had known how to exploit. The Beaumont family was black. Free black landowners in Ohio in the 1840s, which was not impossible but was precarious in the specific way that prosperity is precarious when the systems designed to protect it are operated by people who do not consider your prosperity legitimate. They had legal title to their land. They had documentation. They had done everything right. And it had not been enough, because the people who took from them had access to the mechanisms that make documentation mean something, and had used that access to make the Beaumont's documentation mean nothing. I sat with the Beaumont folder in my lap for a long time. The documents inside it were organized chronologically. Cecelia had assembled, from various archives and records offices, a remarkably complete picture of the Beaumont family from their arrival in this county in 1809 to their disappearance from the records in 1847. Land purchases. Tax records. Church records. A few personal documents, a receipt, a letter, a hand-drawn map of their farm. The texture of lives, assembled from the fragments that survived. And then the gap. The absence. The place where the record stopped. Cecelia had documented that gap too. Had noted, with care, which records existed and which did not. Had flagged the places where the record should have continued and didn't. Had built a picture of the erasure as methodically as she had built a picture of the lives that preceded it. At the back of the folder, behind all the documents, was a handwritten list. Names. The same list I had found in the binder. But here, on the last page, she had added something she hadn't included before. A note to herself, in pencil, small and precise: find them. Whatever is left of them. Find them and give this back. The 6th drawer contained one item. A sealed envelope. Cream-colored, the same quality of paper as the journal. On the front, in Cecelia's handwriting, for whoever finds this room. I held it for a long time without opening it. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, dated 1999. She wrote, "I have spent my life trying to undo something that my family did before I was born. I do not know if that is possible. I do not know if the work I have done in this room amounts to anything that the world will find useful or significant or actionable. I am not a lawyer or a historian or an archivist. I am a woman who found a letter in a mirror frame and could not unknow what it told her." She wrote, "The Beaumont family deserves to know that their history survived. That someone kept it. That the erasure did not succeed completely, because one person, imperfect, too slow, too hesitant, too uncertain, kept looking and kept documenting and kept this room." She wrote, "I am leaving this house to the county because I have no family to leave it to, and I cannot bear the thought of it being sold to someone who will throw everything in this room into a dumpster. I know that is probably what will happen anyway. I know that county ownership is not the same as guarantee. But it is what I have." She wrote, "If you are someone who understands what is here, I am asking you to finish what I started. Not because you owe me anything. Not because the work is easy or the path is clear. But because 37 names deserve more than a folder in a sealed basement. Because the truth I assembled over 60 years of looking deserves to reach the people it belongs to. And because I am tired of carrying it alone and I need to give it to someone." She wrote, at the very end, I hope the house is treating you well. It is a good house. It has kept these things safe for a very long time. I think it knew what it was doing. I sat on the stone floor of Cecelia's basement with her letter in my hands, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. Not since Marcus left. Not since the job collapsed. Not since the version of my life I had believed in had revealed itself as a stage set and I had found myself standing in the rubble of it, trying to figure out what came next. I cried. Not elegantly. Not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and releases something you didn't know was held. For Cecelia and her 60 years of solitary work. For the Beaumont family and their 37 names. For the professor who had never heard back. For the room that had waited 26 years for someone to open the door. And maybe, underneath all of that, for myself. For the woman who had lost everything and spent $500 on an abandoned mansion because it was the only thing that had felt like a good idea in months. For the particular grace of finding yourself in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, not because you planned it, but because you were paying attention. I wiped my face. I stood up. I gathered the envelope and the letter and held them carefully. And I said, out loud, to the room, to Cecelia, to whoever might be listening in the way that sealed rooms full of kept things might be listening, I'll finish it. The first thing I did the next morning was make a list. This is how I have always handled things that feel too large to hold. I break them into pieces. I write them down. I make them into a sequence of manageable steps because a sequence of manageable steps is something I know how to move through, and something I know how to move through cannot defeat me, regardless of how impossible it looks from the outside. The list had 5 items. 1. Find a professional archivist to assess and properly preserve the collection. 2. Locate the original county deed records and cross-reference them with Cecelia's documentation. 3. Contact the State Historical Society. 4. Find a lawyer who handled historical land claims. 5. Find the Beaumont descendants. That last item was the one I wrote and then stared at for a long time. Because it was the one that mattered most and the one I knew least about how to approach. 37 names. People who had been in this county in the 1840s and then, as far as the official record was concerned, simply stopped. Who had been erased not just from the land but from the local consciousness, the kind of erasure that happens not in a single moment but over generations, as the people who know the truth die and the people who benefit from the lie keep quiet and eventually even the lie becomes unnecessary because everyone who might have contested it is gone. I started with what I had. The list at the back of the Beaumont folder included some geographic information. A few names had notations about where the record suggested people had gone after 1847. Indiana appeared twice. One name had Cincinnati, 1850 census written next to it. Another had moved north, per church record 1849 with a question mark. I sat with my laptop at the kitchen table and I began. I want to be honest about what genealogical research looks like in practice, because there is a version of this story where I sit down at a computer and within a few hours I have found the Beaumont descendants and everything resolves beautifully and quickly. That is not what happened. What happened was weeks. What happened was dead ends and spelling variations and census records that were incomplete and digitization errors and the particular frustration of searching for a family whose paper trail had been deliberately disrupted at a critical moment and had never fully recovered. What happened was that I found people. Slowly. Incompletely. In the way that you find people when you are following a thread through a century and a half of American history. The first confirmed descendant I found was a woman named Dorothy. She was 73 years old and lived in Cleveland, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of a man named James Beaumont who appeared on Cecelia's list with a birth year of 1831. She had a family history page on a genealogy website that she had clearly built herself over many years, with the particular care of someone for whom this was not a hobby but a responsibility. It included a section she had titled The Ohio Years that acknowledged a gap in the family history around the 1840s that she had never been able to explain. I sat with my cursor over the contact form for a long time. What do you say? How do you begin a message to a stranger that starts with, I bought an abandoned house at auction for $500 and in the basement I found 60 years of research that suggests your family's land was stolen from them in the 1840s and I think I can prove it. I wrote 7 drafts. Then I sent the 8th, which was shorter than all of them and said essentially, my name is Nora. I have recently acquired a property in your family's county of origin. I have found historical documents that I believe are relevant to your family history, and I would very much like to speak with you if you are willing. I pressed send and then I went into the garden because I needed to be outside and I pulled weeds for 2 hours until my phone rang. It was a Cleveland area code. Dorothy's voice was careful when she answered. The voice of someone who has learned to be measured with strangers. She said she had received my message. She said she was not sure what to make of it. She said she had spent 20 years trying to understand the gap in her family's history and that she had encountered, over those 20 years, a number of people who claimed to have information and did not, and she hoped I would understand if she was not immediately enthusiastic. I said I understood completely. I said, would you like me to send you photographs of the documents? She said, yes. Send me what you have. I sent her 40 photographs that evening. Survey maps. Deed records. 2 of the personal letters from the binder. The list of 37 names, because I wanted her to see that someone had kept that list, had assembled it name by name over decades, had considered each person on it important enough to find and record. I did not sleep that night either. At 6:15 the following morning my phone rang again. Dorothy said, where did you get these? I told her about the house. About the auction. About the sealed door and the basement and Cecelia and the 60 years of work assembled in this room. I told her about the note left in the flat file cabinet and the letter in the envelope addressed to whoever finds this room. I read her the last paragraph of that letter, the one about 37 names deserving more than a folder in a sealed basement. Dorothy was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I knew there was something. I always knew there was a gap and I always knew it wasn't an accident. My grandmother told me, her grandmother had told her, that something had happened in Ohio. Something that the family didn't talk about. Not because they had forgotten it but because talking about it was painful in the way that if you kept picking at it, it would open you up in ways you couldn't close again. So they put it away. And eventually putting it away became not talking about it and not talking about it became not knowing and by the time it got to me there was just this gap. This silence where something had been. I said, Cecelia spent 60 years trying to fill that silence. Dorothy said, I know. I can see that in what you sent me. She was quiet again. Then she said, can I come and see it? Dorothy arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after that phone call. She drove herself from Cleveland, 4 hours, and she arrived in the early afternoon with the particular composure of a woman who has been preparing herself emotionally for something and has decided that composure is the appropriate response. She was tall. Silver-haired, close-cropped. She moved carefully, deliberately, the way people move when they are paying attention to everything. She stood on the porch of the mansion and looked at the house for a long moment before she said anything. She said, my grandmother's grandmother would have known this land. Before the house was built, maybe, or just after. I said, yes. Your family's connection to this land predates this house by decades. She looked at me with an expression I found difficult to read. Not quite grief. Not quite anger. Something that contained both of those things and was larger than either of them. She said, let's go in. I took her through the house first. I wanted her to have the context, the sense of the place and its history and the woman who had lived here and kept what she kept. I told her about Cecelia. About the mirror frame and the letter and the 31 years of not looking followed by 30 more years of looking. Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked precise questions at precise moments. She was, I learned over the course of that afternoon, a retired appellate judge. She had spent 30 years evaluating evidence. She knew exactly what questions to ask. When I finished, she said, "And the basement?" I took her down the stone steps. I had set up proper lighting by then, work lights on extension cords, warm and steady, illuminating the whole room. Dorothy walked into the room and stopped. She stood in the center of Cecilia's basement and she turned slowly, taking in the shelves and the workbench and the table and the flat file cabinet and the extraordinary density of 60 years of work arranged on every surface. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she walked to the shelves and she found the Beaumont folder. She took it down. She opened it. She stood at the workbench and read it, slowly, from the first page to the last. When she reached the list of 37 names, she stopped. She read it once. Then she read it again. She set the folder down very carefully on the workbench surface. She said, quietly, to no one in particular or to the room or to Cecelia, "You kept us." I looked away. I looked at the stone wall, at the wooden beams, at the thin line of light coming down the stairs from the study above. I gave her the moment because it was hers and I had no business being inside it. After a while she said, "What do you want to do with all of this?" I said, "I want to do what Cecelia asked. I want to finish what she started. I don't know exactly what that means legally or historically or practically. But I know what she asked and I think she was right to ask it." Dorothy looked at me for a long moment with the evaluating quality of someone who has spent 3 decades determining whether the person in front of them means what they say. She said, "I have colleagues. People who handle exactly this kind of historical claim. People at the university who study exactly this pattern of land displacement. And I have family, more than you might think, once you start pulling the thread. A lot of people who grew up knowing there was something missing and not knowing what it was." I said, "Cecelia found 37 names." Dorothy said, "I think there are more than 37 of us now." She smiled when she said it. Not a happy smile exactly, too much complexity behind it for happiness to be the right word. Something earned. Something that had traveled a long distance to arrive. We stood in that basement for another hour, going through the collection together. Dorothy with her judge's precision, asking questions about provenance and chain of custody and the specific documents that would carry the most evidentiary weight. Me with my archivist's eye, explaining how Cecelia had organized things and what I had found where. We were, without having planned it, doing the work. Continuing what Cecelia had started. 2 women in a basement that had been sealed for 26 years, doing the work. Before she left, Dorothy stood in the doorway of the basement and looked back at the room. She said, "She must have been a remarkable person." I said, "I think she was a person who found something she couldn't unknow and spent her life trying to do right by it. I think that's its own kind of remarkable." Dorothy said, "Yes. I suppose it is." She drove back to Cleveland in the early evening. She said she would make calls in the morning. She said she would be in touch within the week. She was in touch within 2 days. That was 8 months ago. I am still in the house. The kitchen is finished and the main staircase is restored and the East Wing study has its shelves intact and will stay that way. The basement is no longer sealed. It has been assessed by 2 professional archivists from the State Historical Society, both of whom described Cecilia's collection as among the most significant bodies of privately assembled historical documentation they had encountered in their careers. The Beaumont family, or the people who carry that history, who are more numerous than 37 and spread across 7 states, are in conversation with historians and lawyers and county officials about what acknowledgement looks like, what record correction looks like, what it means to bring a buried history into the light after a century and a half of deliberate darkness. I am not the center of that story. I want to be clear about that. I was the person who opened the door. The work that is happening now belongs to Dorothy and her family and the historians and the legal minds and ultimately to the Beaumont name and what it represents. I opened the door. I finish what Cecelia asked me to finish. What comes next is not mine to own. But I am still here. I am still in this house, which is becoming, slowly and incrementally and with the particular satisfaction of work done with attention and care, something real. Not a stage set. Not a construction. A real house, with real history in it, kept honestly and used honestly and loved in the specific way you love something that has asked something difficult of you and that you chose to answer. Cecilia's chair is still at the table in the basement. I have not moved it. The cotton gloves are still there. The magnifying glass, still positioned at the angle she left it. The lamp I refilled with oil. On the night Dorothy called to tell me that the first meeting with the County Historical Commission had gone better than expected, I went down to the basement and I lit it. The basement filled with warm light for the first time in 26 years. I sat in Cecilia's chair. I looked at the room around me, the shelves still full, the documents still present, the work still here even as it moved out into the world where it was always meant to go. I thought about the woman who had sat in this chair before me, for decades, in the dark, keeping things alive that the world had tried to extinguish. I thought about what she had written in her journal in 1987. Whether the truth is always worth the cost of telling it. I think I know her answer now. I think I knew at the moment I read the question. Yes. Not because the truth is easy. Not because the cost is small or the path is clear or the outcome is guaranteed. But because the alternative, the sealed room, the padlocked door, the history that disappears because no one kept it, is a cost of a different kind. One that is paid not once but continuously, by everyone who comes after, in the form of a gap where something should be. A silence where a name should be. A question mark where a life should be. Cecelia chose to keep the room. I chose to open the door. Dorothy chose to come. That is how these things work, I think. Not in grand gestures. Not in single moments of heroism. In a sequence of ordinary choices made by ordinary people who found themselves in possession of something true and decided, each in their own time and in their own way, that the truth deserved better than a locked door. I blew out the lamp when I went upstairs that night. Not because I was finished with it. Because I knew I would come back. I always come back to this room. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever stood in front of a door and wondered whether to open it, leave a comment. Tell me what you found on the other side. Because I believe that most of the most important things in a life begin exactly that way. With a door. With a choice. With someone deciding that what is behind it matters enough to look. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more rooms in this house. There are always more rooms.